Okay, let's start. Welcome everybody, people who are watching this live and people who are watching this over dinner or during their breaks later than today. And especially welcome to Rachel, our speaker today. I have to say a few words about Rachel. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Geoscience at Aarhus University in Denmark. She came there via Lamont Doherty Observatory from Columbia University in New York. And she is a product of the Brown University, where she did her master's and PhD. She's a paleoclimatologist, I would say, and looks at this interaction between environment and hominin evolution, behavioral change, which is very exciting use of molecular tools that have been developed in paleoclimatology via organic geochemistry. Welcome again, Rachel, and you will be talking today about Sahel climate, and I can't wait to see your talk.
Great, yeah, thanks so much. That was a very nice introduction. I regret to inform you that I'm not actually going to be talking a lot about human evolution today, but that is true that a lot of my work has ties to that sort of field. But today I'll be talking about the paleoclimate of the Western Sahel through shifting boundary conditions. And this work was initially supported by the Center for Climate and Life at Columbia University and is now supported by the NSF to us still back in the States. But I'm now at Aarhus University in Denmark. Yeah, I'm loving it. So, all right. So the study site for this project is the Sahel, as I mentioned, and this is the ecological transition zone between the Saharan Desert and the rainforests of Central Africa, highlighted here. And this broad region contains a range of different ecosystems, making it sensitive, both sort of in strength, but also spatial extent to changes in climate. It is home to millions and millions of people who use the land for a range of pastoralism and agricultural techniques. But the IPCC says that this region and surrounding regions are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of global warming. This includes changes in water availability all over the continent, sort of denoted by those raindrops, and specifically here in West and Central Africa, agricultural changes, changes in ecosystem range, as well as conflict zones resulting from these changes may occur in the future. Droughts and flooding and wildfires will and already do have major effects on the livelihood, the agriculture, and water availability in the region. But if we knew just how the landscape was going to respond to external forcings, that may ease some of the hardships brought about by climate change on the people that are living there today. But future projections from models often disagree about even the sign of precipitation change, which drives a lot of these potential environmental responses. So you can see pretty well, the models do a pretty good job of predicting drying in the north and the south and wetting in East Africa. But in this Western Sahel region, the annual and seasonal prediction is actually split, shown here by white. And a lot of this uncertainty stems from the sort of complex mixture of external and regional feedbacks and drivers on the region. So how can we use, how can we constrain these responses? Well, past climate informs future climate. So we can look into the paleoclimate record in times of higher CO2 and higher global temperatures, shown here with on the right with their associated timeframes, to understand how future terrestrial ecosystems could behave in these shifting boundary conditions. For instance, many paleoclimate studies point to the Pliocene as a recent time period with elevated CO2, but perhaps it's time to look even further back in time during other intervals of higher CO2 that we haven't already sort of surpassed. So a very nice recent compilation of benthic. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but I'm going to keep using it in hopes that you can see it as a pointer. But benthic and oxygen and carbon isotopes from over the Cenozoic, over the last 66 million years, shows that Earth's climate and carbon cycle have varied a lot in the past, with sort of long-term trends, cyclical oscillations getting more extreme in recent times, and then these transient events as well. And Westerhold here is pointing to specific events documented in the paleoclimate record, such as the PETM here and the mid-Miocene climate optimum, as well as the onset of Northern Hemisphere glaciation and other sort of major documented events. And these particular events and temperature levels in the past are linked with projections of future climate, as I said. So here is the little key, and it's a little hard to see, but all the way on the right are those sort of levels of different emission scenarios. So RCP 8.5, of course, is the most extreme of these cases, and this is coming close to past climate, perhaps in the mid-Miocene climate optimum, but potentially even back to the Eocene. On a regional scale, though, there have been major transitions as well, not shown here, that could play a huge role on regional terrestrial climate on a more local scale, particularly terrestrial climate where people are actually living. So this could include things like the onset of seafloor grassland expansion, as well as the initiation of Saharan dust. So in terrestrial tropical Africa, that's what I'll be talking about moving forward. There are various forcings that we commonly point to as drivers of paleoclimate change. And if we understand what is driving the climate, we can actually get at a much deeper questions pertaining to the mechanisms of climate change, as well as our current and future relationship to global warming. So on one hand, global climate during the Quaternary, shown here 2 million years ago to present on the left. This is just sort of an example. This Quaternary climate on a global scale is often characterized by this benthic foraminiferal oxygen isotope stack shown here in blue. And this records, of course, ice volume as well as deep sea temperatures. So these glacial interglacial cycles are linked with changes across the globe, including ocean circulation, carbon dioxide levels, global temperatures, temperature gradients, and so on. So these are this is a large scale global signal. And while these processes are thought to be linked or paced by the high latitudes, these feedbacks associated with the glacial interglacial cycles can have impacts across the world, including potentially in terrestrial tropical Africa. On the other hand, the patterns we would expect, sorry, not on the other hand, just the patterns we would expect from a climate record driven by these high latitude paced processes are a cooling trend through time or a drying trend, a gradual increase in the amplitude of variability, as well as a change in the periodicity of those cycles through time. But then on the other hand, tropical climate is generally thought to be driven mainly by regional monsoon systems, as this seminar series is about. And this is, of course, caused by this land sea temperature and pressure gradient controlled by low latitude summer insolation on longer timescales, which I'm showing here in red. So this varies dominantly with orbital precession at 21 kiloyears, as well as being paced, or the amplitude is being paced by eccentricity at the 100 kiloyear scale. And the patterns that we would expect from our climate records driven by these lower latitude processes would be a stable mean state through time, or no trend like we see in the benthic stack, an oscillation in the variability through time, as well as periodicities at the precession and eccentricity scales that stay the same despite the glacial interglacial change through time. So we, of course, have existing indicators of African paleoclimate here being shown over the last 10 million years to present at the top. These are records from West, North, and Eastern Africa. So here again is the benthic stack ice volume curve on the left. And the dust records in this sort of olive green show similarities with the patterns found in the benthic stack in terms of the periodicity and the trend. We also see this aridification trend in the desert pollen shown here, and the soil carbonate records from East Africa shown here on the right. So this aridification trend, as well as the periodicity we see in the higher resolution dust record, indicate that African climate is likely linked with the sort of global cooling and ice sheet growth, at least of the Pleistocene. But we also have records over the same sort of time interval that show similarity with low latitude insolation rather than these glacial interglacial cycles by documenting precession and eccentricity cycles as we find in low latitude insolation. Records of deep lakes shown here on the left, each one of those sort of columns is a different large lake basin in East Africa. These show synchronous deep lake intervals with 400 kiloyear cyclicity, which is also a periodicity of eccentricity. The Mediterranean sapropels shown, just a picture shown on the right, are these very sort of iconic records of this monsoonal rainfall, these precession-driven wet, dry cycles. So these more binary records, these wet, dry records of rainfall can give us a lot of information on sort of the periodicity of the paleoclimate cycles, but not a lot on the trend or the amplitude of the variability. So more continuous and quantitative records of paleoclimate here from leaf wax isotopes from Jess Tierney are better able to resolve all three of those patterns we're searching for: trend, amplitude, and periodicity. These records, this record from the Gulf of Aden off the coast of Northeast Africa shows evidence of low latitude insolation documented by this dashed line, but also a modulation of sort of the mean hydroclimate response corresponding to the marine isotope stages shown at the bottom. You can see sort of mean increases and decreases in the amount of precipitation sort of overprinted onto those insolation cycles. So this mixture of signals perfectly demonstrates why we would need to use these continuous, highly resolved geochemical records to disentangle the relative influences between the high and low latitudes, as well as other processes, to better understand sort of how and when those effects take place and are intertwined. Okay, but however, off the west coast of Africa, shown here, these are records from the Marine Dufresne Corps as well as ODP 659 from my old lab mate, Nick O'Mara, who's now at Yale University. These leaf wax records show slightly different, although related drivers. This vegetation record, this delta C13 record of leaf waxes, which I'll get into, this is following the CO2 curve quite nicely. And the precipitation record, though, in blue up here, it's not just the what we think of as the West African monsoon system driven by this low latitude insolation, but they point to a cross equatorial insolation gradient as the main driver in this case, in this region. Just to go over this, this third possibility in the context of a high latitude ice volume signal that could affect tropical Africa, that would potentially force the African rain belt related to the ITCZ further south with major ice sheet growth. This would generally, in the Pleistocene at least, or the after the mid-Pleistocene transition, be on a 100 kiloyear signal. If it was just the low latitude insolation causing the monsoon, this would of course have that 21 kiloyear and 100 kiloyear signal in the paleoclimate record. But this cross equatorial gradient has some signal of the obliquity cycle, of this 41 kiloyear cycle, which we don't think of having a big effect in the tropics, because it's really, the tilt is really affecting the poles mostly. And so the idea is that with stronger obliquity on this 41 kiloyear cycle, there's enhanced southwesterly winds bringing additional monsoonal moisture from the South Atlantic across the equator to our study site. So that's sort of an explanation that they point to as what could drive the pattern that they find in their Pleistocene delta D of wax record. So in the context of this previous work and the motivation for this study, we can target specific research questions pertaining to, again, the relative influence of the low and high latitude drivers on climate and environmental changes in the Sahel region, as well as what the relationship between hydroclimate and vegetation are, because we do see some conflicting evidence of different drivers. And of course, we can go back to that original motivation to analyze how these variables change across these global and regional boundary condition changes. And by boundary conditions, I'm talking about global CO2 levels, global temperatures, but also regional landscape changes through time. So to decipher all of these patterns and answer these questions, I'm also going to use leaf wax biomarker isotopes, which Melissa Burke gave such a nice introduction to last week. Of course, it was at a different time, so I had to watch it online, but it was such a nice introduction. And again, leaf waxes are a powerful tool because of their preservation across archives and continuously through time that allow us to reconstruct climate at a relatively high temporal resolution. These waxes are produced by plants to prevent evaporation as well as physical damage to the leaves. And compound-specific analyses of the waxes allow us to separate out the hydrocarbons derived from different sources, which I'll show on the next page. And so we can measure both hydrogen and carbon isotopes to get a good idea of precipitation and vegetation change throughout time. So to obtain these measurements, the samples that have undergone many series of steps to isolate the leaf wax compounds in the lab, in the wet chemistry lab, are introduced finally to a gas chromatograph, or a GC, that's coupled to an isotope ratio mass spectrometer. And this allows us to perform these compound-specific analyses. The GC spreads out the compounds in the samples, and so we can target specifically these long-chain waxes, which are from terrestrial plants, despite where the waxes may be preserved, in this case, a marine sediment core. So we can get at the rainout history of the region from the delta D of wax. So this is the deuterium, hence D to hydrogen ratio of the plant waxes. And these are a reflection, again, of the history of the water used by that plant. And so you can see on the right that on the left, that the delta D of the alkanes, this is the compound, the leaf wax compound that I'm going to be focusing on, the delta D of the alkanes is highly correlated with the delta D of the rainwater. So the isotope ratio of the meteoric water is thought to be mainly a function, in this region at least, of precipitation strength or rainfall amount, hence the amount effect, as in the more and more it rains, the more heavy isotopes or deuterium are removed from the system, and the more depleted or more negative isotopic signature remains. All right, we can also measure carbon isotopes from these same compounds, the same exact samples, which is a just powerful in and of itself. And in this system, we utilize the fact that C3 and C4 plants fractionate carbon differently during leaf wax production. That's sort of shown here at the bottom. And in this region, the plants that use the C3 pathway are dominantly trees and shrubs, whereas the C4 plants are dominantly grasses. So I'll talk a bit about more about this later, and there's actually quite a bit of internal variability within each of these end-member scenarios. And so we can measure the waxes to see what type of plants were on the landscape in that watershed at that given time. So we will be using the carbon isotopes, as I just said, to reconstruct vegetation, but they can also be used to perform a vegetation correction of the delta D isotopes, because the two different types of plants actually fractionate hydrogen to a different extent as well. So here is a sort of schematic from Saxa et al. Of hydrogen isotope fractionation of precipitation on the y-axis, with stronger precipitation documenting less enriched isotopes. So that was described by the amount effect. So that's sort of what's held here. And then this meteoric water is fractionated in a few different steps before being used during photosynthesis for leaf wax generation. But the thing to pay attention to is that the C3 and C4 plants fractionate hydrogen also to different extents, and thus they have different apparent fractionation factors. So we can use the carbon isotope measurements from the waxes to determine this C3, C4 makeup of a sample to apply a specific known fractionation factor to get from the delta D of wax back to this delta D of the precip signal. And this will become important later. Okay, so to answer our research questions, how are we going to do that? We're going to use a marine sediment core off the coast of Ghana here in the Gulf of Guinea from ODP leg 159, site 959, which is highlighted by this big red star. And this site is receiving terrestrial leaf waxes from a pretty large region, including from river systems, but generally from wind sources, likely adhered to dust particles and other particles blowing off of the coast. So we really are recording leaf wax history from a relatively large Western Sahel region. This can also be documented, sort of the regionality of the sediment core can also be documented from XRF records and dust records from this core and surrounding cores sort of up the coast of West Africa that document clear regional signals rather than local runoff dominating the signal. So Polisar et al. Put together sort of put together aspects from various other studies, as well as some new data, a very nice age model from 959, the sediment core, based on biostratigraphy, mostly using calcareous nanofossils, which has been added to, which I'm not actually showing here, but it's been added to with some dinoflagellate cysts, but also the group in Utrecht has identified many more Miocene tie points to be used for an age model, typically using diatom assemblages. I'm not actually in this talk going to be showing, I think, any data on an age scale, actually, because you'll see why. More tweaking still needs to be done, and we're working on oxygen isotope records and such to really hone in on this age model. But you can see I'm showing an example from the core here on the right, that even at 30x, this is nearly 300 meters down, we do have these really nice dark and light sediment layers that we can assume is driven by consistent climate cycles in the context of that absolutely dated core section. So these dark light layers, as well as some other core data, led our targeted sampling, so that we think that we have a good grasp on the amount of time each of our study windows spans, as well as where in absolute time they actually lie. So going back to this sort of overview of global climate and carbon cycle from now the latter half of the Cenozoic, including the Oligocene, Miocene, Pliocene, and Pleistocene, I've highlighted the timing of 4 study windows that we've put together from the 959 core. This is the data that I'll be showing today. And these 4 windows highlighted here in these pink vertical bars correspond roughly to the organic, the Oligocene-Miocene transition, the onset of seafloor grasslands, the intensification of Northern Hemispheric glaciation, as well as the late Pleistocene, really high amplitude, strong glacial interglacial cycles at the top of the core. And you might have noticed that they're numbered 1, 4, 5, 6. I left that in there. This is a artifact from the proposal, but that is because we're expecting we're in the process of processing more data from Windows 2 and 3, but we don't yet have that isotope data, so I won't be showing that just yet. All right, and those windows are from the Miocene, especially to help bracket this mid-Miocene climate optimum. Another way of looking at these study windows, again numbered 1, 4, 5, 6, is more directly in terms of global temperature anomaly. And so now this is sort of on a squished time axis in the earlier stages, and more expanded in the recent times. And again, these 4 studies are highlighted during the Oligocene, Miocene, Pliocene, and Pleistocene here. And this plot includes future climate projections shown at the right. And so the goal is to use the data from curves such as this to really contextualize the boundary conditions at play during these windows of terrestrial climate change. We'll be making just really simple cross plots like this schematic here, with global temperature anomaly versus a sort of change in either climate or environmental mean or variability in these specific study windows through time. Okay, so let's look at some data. Here I'm showing you the delta D of wax from, and I'm so sorry that I'm a paleoclimatologist, and so I'm plotting things from oldest to the right to earliest or latest to the left. So sorry, I keep switching on you. But this new delta D of wax data from the Oligocene, Miocene, Pliocene, and late Pleistocene, and those general timeframes are based off of the age model, the updated age model but I'm plotting the specific windows against depth. On the y-axis, we have more depleted signatures up, because that signifies more rainfall or stronger rainfall. And we can start to see shifts in mean hydroclimate or monsoon strength through time, with somewhat surprisingly a wetting trend up to the left, which, just based on sort of thermodynamics, may not be what we would expect in this cooling world. We can also look at the amplitude of variability between the time slices, and this appears relatively similar, although there does seem to be higher sort of variability in the Miocene and perhaps the Oligocene, although there may be some outliers in the data that need to be looked at. So to look at periodicity, there's preliminary evidence that some other things other than simple low latitude summer insolation may be controlling precipitation strength in West Africa, particularly throughout the latter half of the Cenozoic here. So here in purple, I'm plotting the cross-equatorial gradient, and this is dominated again by the low latitude insolation, but this additional sort of cross-equatorial moisture source into the region. And the reason that I'm saying the geography may affect the periodicity of climate variability is because we really don't see this signal in Eastern Africa, where we have quite a few of these delta D of wax records at this point. But again, we see generally good agreement between our record and this curve, but of course, this needs to be tested in terms of age. This is on depth, so this will certainly be looked at more down the line when we have better constraints on the age model on these sorts of scales that we can look at periodicity. So for now, we're going to stick to analyses of mean and amplitude of variability, which don't rely so heavily on this sort of orbital scale age model. Okay, I had mentioned that this vegetation correction earlier during the sort of methods section of the talk, because different plant types, the C3 and C4 plants, fractionate hydrogen differently. So here is the vegetation corrected delta D of precip record now. So we've used that delta C13 of the waxes to correct the delta D of the wax to get at the delta D of precip. And the trend seems to diminish significantly, if not completely. This is really interesting, and I will be showing the vegetation data later, but what do other sort of long-term records say about the precipitation over the latter half of the Cenozoic? Well, this actually agrees with previous work from 959. This again is Polisar et al. Their work from 959 as well as 659, which I mentioned, which is much further up along the coast. This biomarker work, so this is also delta D of precip as well as the carbon isotopes on the left, but this delta D of precip shows that there really wasn't much of a hydroclimate change throughout at least the last sort of 15 million years. So it agrees quite nicely with that, but it is a much lower resolution record. They did find in the vegetation record that while C4 grassland is expanding, there's no sort of similar hydroclimate change, indicating potentially different forcing mechanisms between the two. Looking at more similar data, this is an orbital scale or orbitally resolved record, similar to what we're looking at. This is also from that site 659 up here. This leaf wax, as well as XRF data in the yellowy orange here, which is also indicative of hydroclimate from different windows, including 2 in the Pliocene and 1 in just the last 100 kiloyears. They have delta D in blue showing wetter conditions in the Pliocene with a sort of trend or shift, at least, towards a more arid environment in the last 100 kiloyears. But again, this is delta D of wax rather than a vegetation corrected, which we also see a trend in. So it's possible that that would sort of remove that trend. And in their XRF reconstruction, this is from a recent paper by Anja Kraker, they're not seeing much of a hydroclimate shift, similar to what we're seeing and similar to what Polisar finds. They also compare their sort of amplitudes of variability through time. This is something that we're looking sort of to add to our data down the line. But again, this is sort of an ongoing, new data, ongoing project. They're looking at the vegetation and hydroclimate amplitude of variability in the Pleistocene compared to the Pliocene. But then they actually plot the Polisar data, these longer term records from both 959 and 659, and find that at least vegetation variability may have actually been much greater than the variability in the specific windows. So this long-term variability had a much bigger shift than when you're looking at it on these orbitally resolved records. So what do we find in our carbon isotope records from the Miocene, Pliocene, Pleistocene, even in the Oligocene, in these orbitally resolved records? Well, here is the delta C13 of wax from each of the 4 study windows with more depleted values plotted up. I know other people plot it the other way around, but we're just keeping consistent with the potential idea that that strong precipitation leads to more C3 or tree-like vegetation, more closed canopy systems. And this data may look quite striking with the extremely low variability in the Miocene and Oligocene. But it is extremely crucial to note that C4 grassland expansion didn't occur until about 10 million years ago, which actually Polisar et al., the previous plot I was showing, they identified this shift in the 959 core. And so the variability we see in the Oligocene and Miocene is purely within that C3 end member. Despite this, we can look at the Pliocene and late Pleistocene and compare those two. And again, we will have more Miocene data after this transition, hopefully at some point. And we do see a higher amplitude of variability and more C3-like plants in the Pliocene compared to more recent times. So getting back to this variability in the Miocene and Oligocene, we can see, we can sort of view this as a limit of the leaf wax biomarker proxy that only sort of gives us this idea of C3 versus C4 vegetation, or we can delve a bit deeper and disentangle the processes involving the variability that does exist in these earlier regions. So let's take a look. I'm going to show this Miocene figure, but with a much better, more appropriate y-axis, along with the delta D of wax data here. Okay, so with this zoomed in version of the Miocene plot, again, about 11 million years ago, so just before there was the C4 expansion in Africa, we see actually really striking agreement. Typically, we would expect more precipitation, so more depleted isotopes, to lead to more C3 vegetation versus C4. But without the C4 end member existing on the environment prior to 10 million years ago, all of the variance in the records lies in this C3 end member. But actually, if you look at the y-axis, it's really only varying by about 2.5 per mil. It's plotted with 3 per mil on the y-axis. And this is larger than the analytical uncertainty. but this begs the question that what else is sort of dictating this relationship between precipitation and carbon isotope variability. So I've really just started to dig into this. So this is one idea, but it's been shown that there is plant functional type differences within the C3 spectrum shown here on the right. And although this is showing the fractionation factor rather than delta C13 of the waxes, it's showing the same phenomenon. And you can imagine that more precipitation could lead to more biomass. And more biomass could lead to more rainforests, and these rainforests tend to retain more depleted carbon dioxide. And this depleted carbon dioxide would lead to this phenomenon, more depleted leaf wax biomarker isotopes. And so while this is just one idea and we're just starting to think about it, this is actually, I find it very incredible to see 11 million years ago, this very strong relationship with potentially vegetation type and precipitation. This spans maybe 200,000-300,000 years. And of course, there could be other implications as well. So just to zoom back out and view all of our new data, now there's so much. As I've alluded to, there's so much that we'll be able to tease apart with more robust statistical analyses, as well as comparisons with other records, those 659 records in particular, but also pollen records and other long-term reconstructions from the region. But we can start to make some sort of some rough preliminary, I'll call them conclusions, shown in very much a schematic here. So with this increase in CO2 and temperature in the past, we saw that the vegetation, even after the C4 grassland expansion, appeared to get more C4 rich, but actually more stable through time. Through time, but with a decrease in carbon dioxide. Also, on the precipitation side, down below here, the earlier intervals that have higher CO2 and higher temperatures showed an increase in the rainfall variability. And this could have to do with other factors like the landscape changes. So it might not be the CO2, it could actually be the prior to the onset of C4 grasslands, the rainfall feedbacks were stronger. So there's a lot more to look at. But what we do find is that aridity, or the mean monsoon strength, actually appears to be extremely consistent over the last 25 million years. So looking towards the future, going back to those sort of motivating questions of how will the region respond in the future to increase in carbon dioxide, we may expect an increase in C3 vegetation, these more closed canopy systems, however, with more variability and also more precipitation variability, which could lead to more uncertainty in the regional response to climate. So, as I've sort of alluded to, this is very much an ongoing project, and I just want to keep you all sort of updated on where this project we call Toto is going. So again, more windows in the mid and early Miocene will be or are ongoing. We're working on them in lab now. And potentially we might actually access earlier in the core, earlier in the Oligocene, likely from the 959 core, to just add another sort of anchor point to these sensitivity plots. I think very importantly, we're also currently processing a more complete long-term record throughout the 959. So rather than just looking at these windows, which is really important to understand the variability and periodicity of the climate, we want to anchor those in this long-term sort of medium resolution record. So if I remember correctly, the idea is to get a resolution of about 100 kiloyears throughout the last 25 million years. So that'll really anchor us and will also help us sort of decipher between whether it was a change in temperature or whether it was a landscape change, because we know when a lot of those transitions are occurring. We also have the funding from NSF to measure fire biomarkers as well as grassland biomarkers that can differentiate between vegetation, especially earlier prior to the sort of expansion of C4 plants. And this can really help us understand better the vegetation earlier. And of course, the fire, the PAHs, will give us a much better sense of a whole ecosystem view of the region through these windows, as well as the long-term reconstruction. So that could be really interesting. And again, we'll be making more comparisons with other regional records. And then the idea is to also link this back to East Africa as well. We are seeing different sort of orbital scale controls on the climate changes during certain time intervals. And it'll be really interesting to think about what is controlling those different sensitivities to various parameters in insolation. All right, so here are some takeaways on the highly variable climate and environment of the Western Sahel over sort of this second half of the Cenozoic, the last 25 million years. And you can see that there's still quite a few question marks up there. There's a lot more work to be done on this project. And so please stay tuned. Yeah, that's all I have for you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Very, very interesting. Looking forward to more results. And I open the floor for questions. Please ask directly or send me a message.
Can I start? That was really interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing more of the results. One of the things, we've just completed a set of model simulations over the last 3.6 million years. And one of the things that we're seeing is a big influence of the ice sheets. Do you have, I know still data is preliminary, but do you see much change when the ice sheets start growing in the Northern Hemisphere? That you can
So about like 3 million years ago, you're not talking about like the major late Pleistocene. Yeah. So the window that we have is sort of, I think it's like 3.3 to 3 million years ago about. So it's potentially just before this is happening or during. Yeah. And yeah, I haven't delved deeply into each particular window yet, but that window is exciting because it has a very good age model actually. And so because of these sort of XRF tuned records from the same core, and so we should be able to make more direct links, and that would be really exciting. I think this project, as it's funded, doesn't include sort of this bridge between these model sensitivity experiments and such. And I think that is the obvious next step. And I am obviously not a modeler, but would be very, very happy to talk about the possibilities of making those links.
Okay. Yeah.
More questions, please. Until people think about them, I have a couple of questions. One is if you can speculate what's happening in East versus West. What do you think is going on? Yeah, so I think what is going on is really the proximity to just this sort of the continental versus oceanic influence of the Atlantic in Western Africa. I think just how the sort of
continents are, how Africa is shaped, it really allows for this sort of additional effect. It's possible also that the ice sheets have more of a direct link to the rain belt in Western Africa, rather than sort of being just responding to sort of downstream processes from the larger ice sheet in East Africa. We are seeing influence in East Africa from glacial interglacial cycles, particularly in the late Pleistocene. There's a possibility that there's this shift that Paul mentioned at the onset of Northern Hemisphere glaciation in East Africa as well, although that is debated. But we are seeing a sawtooth pattern. We're seeing dry LGM in East Africa, which is really interesting.
Yeah, it wouldn't be that kind of paradoxical to see more.
Yeah, and
glaciation in Eastern Africa and right on the Atlantic to be
yeah,
completely different.
And I'm not a dynamicist, but that is what I would presume. But yeah, and it's interesting. We do have a lot more records from East Africa, from these sort of large lake drilling projects, as well as marine sediment cores. But this study that goes back so far in time with this kind of temporal resolution is pretty rare and doesn't quite exist in the East African system yet. So
yeah. So only we should wait for Christmas as we get more gifts from. So only opportunities to find new things. Exactly. I have another short question. What is a grassland biomarker?
So this are PTMEs. Oh, what does that stand for? It's it's a biomarker that my co-PI and my postdoc advisor Kevin Uno has worked on quite a bit, and it's a way of sort of teasing out grassland variation rather than relying on this sort of C3, C4 spectrum.
So it's grassland specific.
Yeah, exactly. And so he's actually showing, he has data, I think from East Africa, where he shows that yes, we see the C4 grassland expansion at 10 million years ago, but that there was actually a C3 grassland sort of expansion at about 14 million years ago. And so it's a way of using these biomarker tools to get more resolution in the vegetation record, especially prior to this presence of C4.
So quite exciting. More questions, please.
Can answer on YouTube later.
If there are no more questions, I would like to thank you again for being available and sharing results and getting involved with the online community.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hope to see you soon in other context related
in Scandinavia, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and thank you everybody who participated. See you next week. Bye bye.